Every 4 years, homeowners say, I'll wait until after the election to sell my house. But does it really matter? Let's find out if election years truly impact home sales and if you should wait. I've done the research and you might be surprised what I found. Before I get into this, is selling a good or bad idea in an election year? Let me know what you think in the comments. Just a quick note, this is not a political video, left, right, middle, Trump, Biden, Harris, or other. No matter your position or political leanings, we are just talking about election events and their impact on selling your home. I talk to many homeowners daily about selling, and when the subject of election year comes up, the two most common reasons homeowners are concerned include policy outcomes and uncertainty. A sitting president's policies could directly affect the economy and housing market. This includes changes to taxes, loan regulations, housing affordability, inflation, government spending, employment, rent control, interest rates, and that's just to name a few. Now, these concerns are valid, as any of these factors could impact the real estate market directly or even indirectly. Timing is crucial. If you're torn between selling this year or possibly next year, consider these points about policy changes. Executive orders, these can be implemented quickly after an election, but they may take some time to fully roll out. They are also easily reversed by new administration, so they may not be long-term changes. Now, regulatory or legislative changes, these take longer, involve a complex process that can take months or even years, and are more difficult to achieve. However, once implemented, they are also much harder to reverse with a change in leadership. This can result in changes that are irreversible or could last decades. Elections do have an impact on consumer confidence. So I understand reluctance in the face of uncertainty, and this naturally leads to many people to adopt a wait and see approach. We're all wired to avoid change unless there's enough motivation. Past events likely add to the lack of confidence in the market, given that many of us are still recovering from the whiplash that the 2020 pandemic caused in multiple areas of our lives. Even the 2008 great financial crisis over a decade ago left lasting scars for some of us who remain sensitive to drastic changes it has caused. Realtor.com's chief economist, Danielle Hale, said this about the idea that some consumers are choosing to wait until after the election.
But I wonder what that means for the real estate industry, especially when you hear all these reports that folks are holding off even looking for a home until this whole election is resolved. I don't know how many are doing that, but a good many are talking about doing that. What do you think of it?
I do think that the election tends to be more talk than action when it comes to homebuyer decisions. So we have seen sales slow recently, but I don't think that's the election. I think that's actually the macroeconomic conditions, the fact that mortgage rates remain relatively high and are expected to decline. So I think we see a lot of people sort of holding off on moving now, waiting for better conditions this fall when the Fed begins to cut interest rates, which should translate into lower mortgage rates. So we don't see that in the data. Generally, home sales are sort of independent of that broader political uncertainty, but macroeconomic uncertainty does play a role.
She was pretty spot on. While elections can create a lack of consumer confidence, it seems to me that much of this is media driven and often just talking points. Here's another clip by the CEO of Redfin and his take on this.
You know, I had a chance yesterday to talk to the Redfin CEO, Kelman, and he was stepping back from this, the numbers notwithstanding, and describing a lot of what's going on in housing now is psychological. I want you to respond to this. This is from Glenn.
Oh, housing is in just a funk. Even though interest rates have dropped 20 to 30 basis points over the past few weeks, we've seen home buyers still on the sidelines. I think some of it is that home prices just keep rising. So up 4% year on year, even as the housing market has been somewhat slow. The real issue might just be the election. We've talked to so many home buyers who say they're going to wait to see what happens in this election. It is gripping the national psyche.
All right, you might have been more fine-tuned about it, Danielle, say interest rates really will decide this one way or the other. But he is looking at the psychological impact, for example, of homeowners who are not willing to put their homes up for sale. They have very low rate mortgages, and they know it's going to be a lot more expensive to find a new home. And others just are not in the mood to do that if prices slip. So where are we on this real quickly?
Yeah, I think it's more the psychology of low mortgage rates holding people back right now. So sellers right now are looking at the numbers and they just don't pencil out to make a move. It's very expensive because prices are higher, but also they would have to give up a low mortgage rate. And so that mortgage rate lock phenomenon is keeping some on the sidelines. We are seeing that time is going to improve that. So as we get further into the cycle, more homeowners pay down that outstanding mortgage balance. We see more sellers jump into the housing market, and we are seeing the number of sellers tick up very slowly. But I think that's going to eventually help heal the housing market. It's going to give buyers more options and help alleviate some of the price pressure that we've seen.
Danielle's correction of Redfin CEO was accurate to suggest that real estate market issues are being driven by the election year when there are so many other obvious factors at play. Seems to me to suggest he is out of touch on the realities people are facing in this market. Of course, this is just my opinion. Let's see what the data says and you can decide if you agree or not. Here's an article. Political uncertainty has no historic impact on home sales by John Burns. Talk to a real estate agent about expectations for the fall, and they'll likely mention that the housing market will be slow, due in part to the election. A belief in the industry that's become rote. Every election cycle, this becomes a main talking point. Yet most haven't looked at the data. They just repeat what everyone else is saying. Mainly because it probably seems like it makes sense, but does it? But a new report from John Burns Research in Consulting refutes the notion. The firm crunched 35 years of data and concluded that the typical seasonal decline in home sales activity in the fall is actually more severe in non-election years. Political uncertainty and negative campaigning undoubtedly weigh on consumer confidence. The report reads, but do these potential buyers have any bearing on overall home sales? We have found that this type of buyer is the exception rather than the rule. Now, it's almost like it's the loud minority. You hear so often by some. Does that mean the majority of the people looking to sell or buy at that time will be influenced if they have other motivation to do so? Now, there is anecdotal evidence to support the idea that elections affect the home purchase market. A recent survey from Veterans United Home Loans shows that 60% of prospective buyers are taking the election into account, and 38% of respondents were pausing their search until after the election. Question is whether they're actually going to follow through on that. The report from John Burns says no, in part because most people decide to buy homes because of life changes, not because of politics. Now, I 100% agree with this. I've been selling real estate for the last 20 years, and that is a prevailing reason in my experience with my clients who have chosen to sell or buy. Lifestyle and events are the primary drivers for this decision. It is rationalized with financial considerations, of course, yet the motivation has to be strong enough for them to make such a big decision. It doesn't seem reasonable that on its own, an election year is strong enough motivation for most. The study analyzed the year-over-year changes in home sales during the 5 months leading up to November. In election years, new home sales dropped by an average of 10%, while existing home sales fell by 19%. But the declines were actually larger in years without an election, as sales of the new existing homes fell by 14% and 22% respectively. The two election cycles in which home sales fell more than expected were in 2000 and 2008, years in which the economy was in a recession, with 2008 being a dramatic recession directly related to the housing market. The 2008 great financial crisis was definitely a difficult time for many. I was in a unique position to help many homeowners mitigate a situation that was not anticipated or even outside their control. Often the decision to sell during this period was not even an option. My hope is we don't see anything like that ever again in the future. Of course, some buyers will defer home purchases based on politics, and these buyers tend to be vocal about their reasoning, creating the perception that their impact is greater than it actually is. The report reads, be cautious about overstating these buyers' impact on broader housing demand when the data says otherwise. Outside the years of recession, according to this article, data suggests that not only is it not detrimental to sell in a year of an election or the year after, but it is also desirable to. Like anything, we should take this with a grain of salt. It is worth considering when making a decision this big, but of course, there are other factors that will play a bigger part in whether it makes sense for you to sell during the election or afterwards. So here's another article written by Keeping Current Matters titled, Do Elections Impact the Housing Market? They collected data from HUD, Housing of Urban Development, NAR, National Association Realtors, and Freddie Mac. The data collected goes back 3 to 4 decades. So we can get a sense of how these elections affect different market and real estate cycles over the years. Historically, presidential elections have only had a small temporary impact on the housing market. Here's the latest on exactly what happened to home sales, prices, and mortgage rates throughout those time periods. During November, in years when the presidential election takes place, there's typically a slight slowdown in home sales. As Ali Wolf, chief economist at Zonda, explains, this is mostly because some people feel uncertain and hesitant about making big decisions during such a pivotal time. However, it's important to know this slowdown is temporary. Historically, home sales bounce back in December and continue to rise the following year. In fact, data from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, and National Association of Realtors, NAR, shows after 9 of the last 11 presidential elections, home sales went up the next year. Now, according to this chart, there are only 2 years that had negative growth since the election year of 1980. So what about home prices? Home prices are pretty resilient. They generally rise year over year, regardless of elections. The latest data from NAR shows after 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, home prices increased the following year. Since the 1992 election, only 1 year had price decline. The election year 2008 was the year that marked the start of the Great Recession. And anyone in the real estate business at that time knows the price decline had nothing to do with the election or any elected officials. So what about mortgage rates? How were those affected? Looking at the last 11 presidential election years, data from Freddie Mac shows mortgage rates decreased from July to November in 8 of them. Now, important observation is to look at the rates at the time of these elections. Up until 2012, about the end of the Great Recession, rates were either higher or closer to where we are now. The historically low, below 4% interest rates just are not the norm, and you can argue that has led us to some of the issues currently sellers and buyers are facing in the real estate markets right now. Historically, there is no consistent correlation between election years and increased rates. In fact, quite the opposite. This year, assuming we don't see any unexpected events, it seems to be following that same trend. Based on the last week's FOMC meeting, they have signaled a September rate cut, and we are already seeing the rates reduce as a result of that news. With recent job reports from last week, while the report isn't great for consumers as a whole, it does open the door to the likely of a cut in September. It is difficult to celebrate news that is ultimately bad news for consumers and employment. It is relevant in terms of how that affects interest rates for home purchases, so that's why I bring it up. Now, taking a look at the CMA Watch tool, which gives us some insight into the probabilities of the future direction of the Fed funds rate. Now, Fed funds rates are not mortgage interest rates. Mortgage rates are affected by this, but it's not a direct relationship. Yet it does have a significant impact. Right now, the Fed funds rate target ranges at about 5.25 to 5.5. We just had an FOMC meeting, which they hinted towards possible rate cuts in September. It is giving us the probability of a rate cut at about 100%, 78% chance of it going from 5.0 to 5.25 drop, with a 22% of it going from 4.75 to 5.0 cut. A few days ago, it was nearly 100% for just a quarter drop. But with the updates on the job numbers on Friday, a portion of the probability shifted towards a possible 0.5% cut. Now, these numbers change daily, and it doesn't guarantee a rate cut. At the time of making this video, it appears that rates are looking favorable for home sellers like you and home buyers going into the tail end of 2024. For homeowners who want to sell in the next 2 to 3 years, I would ask, are there any policy changes by either side of the ticket you are aware of that would prevent you from buying or selling a home in the next few years? Please share in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. In my experience selling real estate over the last 20 years, I can say with confidence that the primary reason my clients have chosen to sell and or buy are lifestyle decisions. It needs to make sense financially, but something changing in your life is the primary motivation my clients have shared with me over the years. I don't believe this has changed, even with higher interest rates, inflation, and heightened prices. It just seems to me that the balance between the financial rationale holds more weight now than it might in a different type of market. From the data provided here, the election year does not seem to hold much relevance. Now, if you're on the fence about selling this year or waiting until next year, depending on where you are, market conditions in your area, seasonality factors, and mortgage rates, and your reasoning for wanting to make a move is likely going to be the driving factors, not the election, regardless of the outcome of this year's U.S. presidential election. Let me know if you agree, disagree, or have any thoughts on this in the comments. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe, and see you in the next video.